Hey guys, welcome to 2025. I'm EDJ, and I've decided I made a post regarding all of your recommendations, and I have a list. It's on my community tab, and this year I'm determined to cover and watch every video on that list, basically all your recommendations. And first things first, the last poll I did, the Great Northern War won. So we're starting off this year covering this series. Now, I got several comments saying I have to watch the full 2 hour version because it has info that the normal series that Kings and Generals didn't cover. So I found a way to cut this down into parts. So we're gonna stop around the 23-minute mark after the conclusion of the Battle of Narva. With that said, let's get to it. First series of the year, let us go. Let's do this. Let's watch Russia's Imperial Ascendancy, a great deep dive into the Great Northern War. But first I should at least say what I know. I don't really know much other than Sweden. I think under Charles, I forgot which number, but Charles of Sweden rises into prominence of becoming a very accomplished military leader, and then he invades Russia, and as you know, that never works out well for people unless you're the Mongols or Poland. But other than those two exceptions, most people who invade Russia don't last long, and Charles is one of them. I know that he's someone who failed, so let's watch him fail. And Russia come out on top once again. So let's get to it, shall we?
The Great Northern War marked the culmination of a tumultuous couple of centuries in Northern Europe. This war not only changed the balance of power in the region, but on the continent as a whole. At the end of the conflict, one of Europe's newest and most militarized powers lay in ruins, and from its ashes, an empire previously on the fringe of European affairs would start its explosive rise. Welcome to our video on the Great Northern War, on how the Swedish Empire ended and the Russian Empire rose, opening the way to a new era of European history. These long videos are extremely difficult to make, and we hope you'll grace us with your likes, comments, and shares.
This conflict is absolutely packed with big names.
The ascension of Gustavus Adolphus to the throne of Sweden in 1611 is generally regarded as the starting point of the Swedish Empire. The able young king inherited a multitude of conflicts in the region, most notably the Ingrian War against the Tsardom of Russia. The war was concluded with the Peace of Stolbovo in 1618, which stipulated that Sweden would gain Ingria and parts of Karelia, thereby denying Russia access to the Baltic Sea. Russia, which was still recovering from the time of troubles, was unable to offer any significant resistance to Swedish expansion. The war with Poland-Lithuania, which had been sporadically raging on since 1600, was concluded in 1629. Gustavus Adolphus was not able to force Sigismund III of Poland to renounce his claims on the Swedish throne, but he was able to keep most of Livonia, including the important port city of Riga, and gain valuable trade concessions. In 1618, one of the most destructive conflicts in history, the 30 Years' War, had started as well. Although the last phases of the Swedish-Polish War are considered to be a part of the 30 Years' War, the Kingdom of Sweden did not involve itself directly in the war before the King of Denmark, the former champion of Protestantism, had been defeated. Worried about Catholic domination in the empire, Gustavus Adolphus, who was a leader of a Protestant nation himself, intervened on the Protestant side. Although the Catholics were close to a complete victory, the Swedish involvement changed the tides of the war. Sweden's superior army dominated the battlefield even after the death of Gustavus, and by 1648, the war was grinding down to a stalemate. Large parts of Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, were left decimated, demographically, economically, and militarily. In contrast, the Kingdom of Sweden, by acquiring territories in Pomerania and Bremen-Verden at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, became the preeminent power in the Baltic region and one of Europe's leading states. Sweden may have been the dominant power in Northern and Eastern Europe. However, its supremacy in the Baltic was incomplete. Only several years after the Peace of Westphalia, they went to war against Poland in what became known as the Deluge. Even though the Swedes were dominating for most of the war, by the end, the coalition assembled against them proved to be too difficult to deal with, and peace was signed. The peace was a merely symbolic victory for Sweden, as the Polish monarchs finally abandoned their claim to the Swedish throne. Moreover, it also proved that the Kingdom of Sweden could not survive for too long against an organized coalition of enemies. Charles XI ascended to
It's always so interesting when like Europe just forms coalitions. Like, I don't know, just always like like with frickin' Napoleon. Yeah. I guess that's kind of the problem, huh? Once you establish yourself as such a great power, everyone starts eyeing you like, you know what I mean? Like, you become a bit, you give people cause for concern, and Sweden's on the rise right now. Yeah, I don't know crap about Swedish history other than, you know, Bernadotte, Marshal Bernadotte, you know, becomes, the King of Sweden, and he forms a dynasty which is still ongoing to this day, so that's like all I know about Sweden from the Napoleonic era. So this is interesting to see, you know, an active Poland, because usually, like I said, we've covered so much of the Napoleonic era where Poland just basically doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, this is just an interesting time where things are completely new to me, you know.
to the throne of Sweden in 1660, and the majority of his rule was peaceful, barring the relatively short Scanian War of 1675 to 1679. During the war, Sweden managed to defeat Scania, but lost some of its lands in Germany, mostly due to the inefficiency of the army. After the war, Charles XI revitalized the economy and administration of Sweden. However, his most notable reforms were of a military nature. Those reforms aimed to make the Swedish army one of the best in Europe. Charles XI's death in 1697 left his only son, Charles XII, as the new Swedish king. As Charles XII was barely 15 at the time, Peter I of Russia and Christian V of Denmark saw this as an ideal opportunity to exploit Sweden's apparent weakness. On the 21st of April 1699, Russia and Denmark concluded a treaty of mutual assistance in future wars against Sweden. One of the secret articles of the treaty, however, stipulated that Russia would only join the war after it made peace with the Ottoman Empire. Shortly afterwards, Peter concluded a treaty with Augustus of Saxony, who was also the elected ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Augustus was a very proud and extravagant ruler, and his main goal was to return Livonia to the Commonwealth. Livonia, although a land that brought insurmountable wealth to the Swedish crown, was also a source of great concern. After Sweden had gained Livonia in 1629 through the Treaty of Altmark, it gave certain assurances to the old Livonian nobility that they would preserve the rights that they had had under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that they would not lose any of the lands that were in their possession. For the first couple of decades, the relationship between the Swedish monarchs and the Livonian nobility was amicable. Charles X, however, was not as lenient as his predecessors, and by 1655, he intended to revoke a quarter of the lands that belonged to the Livonian nobility, only with the Second Northern War preventing him from doing so. Charles XI would turn his father's plans into a reality after ascending to the throne, and by the time of his death in 1697, the Livonian nobility held only a fifth of the original number of estates. One of the nobles, Johann Reinhold Patkel, outraged by the Great Reduction, agitated the Livonian nobility to rise up against Sweden in rebellion. he was swiftly arrested and sentenced to death, and to avoid execution, Patkul fled from Sweden. Patkul later played a key role in the formation of the anti-Swedish coalition, as he was usually the diplomatic link between Peter, Augustus and Christian, and provided intelligence on the Swedish defences in the Baltic. Sensing the impending danger, Charles XII sent diplomats to Russia in the summer of 1699, with the goal of confirming a peace treaty between the two states from 1661. A skillful diplomat, Peter the Great assured the envoys of his peaceful intentions, but in reality, he had already decided to go to war.
So yeah, Peter the Great is regarded as one of the great, rulers of Russia. We kind of covered a bit about him in the Epic Histories history of Russia. And what's funny? I was watching Kings and Generals, how Rome conquered Greece series. I didn't record it. I just watched that on my own time, and it kind of reminds me like when the Ptolemies had the Ptolemies had a crisis in which they had a new Ptolemy on the throne who was like 6, or basically a child, and then like the Seleucid and Macedonian kingdoms decided they wanted to like take advantage of this and expand their spheres of influence, and this led to Rome getting involved, and that's I just kind of got reminded of that. Obviously a child, a younger man, 15, is now a ruler, and these guys are like, oh sweet, we can take advantage of this. I'm so sorry if you hear knocking or scraping. There's work going on outside my house right now, so I apologize. You're gonna hear knocking, scraping, and all that. Probably this entire series, but yeah. So essentially, it just reminded me of that. And I know Charles goes on to be very impressive, even though he loses to Russia. So it's gonna be interesting to see how he's gonna handle this now that everyone is kind of looking at him as like a weak young kid. So yeah, I'm wondering how he's gonna maneuver with this growing issue now starting.
Augustus II also sent a diplomatic envoy to Sweden, assuring the king of his friendly intentions and asking for Swedish mediation in a dispute between himself and Prussia. While all of these dialogues took place, the coalition continued its preparations for war. Ultimately, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp became alarmed by the Danish naval buildup and informed his ally Charles XII of what had been transpiring. Though both the Swedes and Holstein had tried to resolve the matter peacefully, the new King of Denmark, Frederick IV, refused to negotiate. The first act of war was committed by Frederick's troops in March of 1700, when the Danish army entered lands belonging to the Duke of Holstein, and shortly afterwards laid siege to Tønning. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Baltic Sea, Saxon forces under Augustus entered Livonia and captured the port of Dunemunda. Charles XII, together with his war council, seeing the Danish threat as more immediate, decided to strike at them first. Great Britain and the Netherlands were uneasy at the prospect of a destructive war in the Baltic, as they had trade interests in the region. Fearing that the conflict might destabilize their economies, the maritime powers deployed their fleets to Øresund to ensure that no lasting harm to trade and their merchants would be done. By August, a Swedish force of 16,000 had assembled in Scania. Though attacking the main Danish army and lifting the siege of Tønning seemed like the most secure way to deal a decisive defeat to Frederick IV, Charles opted for the riskier option of attacking the Danish mainland itself. The Swedish fleet, with Charles himself and his troops on board, managed to outmaneuver their more formidable Danish counterpart and make contact with the British and Dutch fleet. The maritime powers were willing to assist the Swedish king, so the Danish fleet was forced to retreat to Copenhagen. Skillfully avoiding parts of the island where coastal batteries were present, Swedish troops subsequently disembarked on Zealand. the Danish mustered up around 700 men and 7 artillery pieces to attack the Swedish disembarking forces. However, they were no match for the 2,500 Swedish soldiers led by Charles himself. It was here that Charles XII saw battle for the first time and proved himself an excellent leader, being the first one to jump into the water and lead the assault.
Young, so far good start. And obviously I think younger people seek glory. You know, so I think you're more fearless when you're younger, or less cautious in a sense, you know? And yeah, overall, great start so far. The dude just got on his boats, quickly went in, quickly secured aid from, you know, Great Britain, and then proceeded to just go on the offensive. Like, obviously, there are 2 issues going on, so he's dealing with the Denmark's the Denmark first, and then jumping over, I'm assuming, quick. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning about Charles in Sweden. Like I said, this is a new period in history I'm not familiar with. We've covered so many of the greats like Napoleon, Alexander, Caesar. So it's kind of cool and refreshing to follow someone new, someone I'm not so familiar with, and seeing what they're made of. And young Charles, I keep calling him young Charles, because he is a young man at this point. Young Charles, I want to see what he's made of.
The Danish were caught completely by surprise with this move, and were starting to panic, as the Swedish army was within a stone's throw of their capital. A few days after Charles set foot on Zealand, more Swedish soldiers landed there as well, and preparations were made for the march on Copenhagen. Meanwhile, the Swedish, Dutch and British fleets blockaded and started bombarding Copenhagen from the sea. With Copenhagen surrounded on both land and sea, Frederick IV of Denmark made peace with the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and peace with Sweden was achieved soon afterwards as well.
Dang, he was quick. He took a very bold and risky maneuver, but it paid off, and him getting the British and other naval powers to immediately help him. Wow, that's obviously, he's got to have some diplomatic skill, right? If he managed to secure that, and they basically just helped him right there, like, that was quick. Wow, I'm impressed.
On the 18th of August 1700, the same day that peace was made between Denmark and Sweden, Peter I of Russia declared war on Sweden and began his offensive into Ingria. The first target of Peter the Great's campaign was Narva, a crucial fort near the Baltic Sea. Peter besieged Narva with an army more than 30,000 strong, and with more than 150 cannons. Such an artillery force would have reduced Narva to rubble, were it not for the fact that the Russians suffered from a lack of ammunition due to bad roads. With trouble brewing in the west, in what would become the War of the Spanish Succession, the fleet of the maritime powers transported the Swedish army back to the mainland before setting sail westwards. As the Swedish army was fully united, Charles was able to set sail for Livonia. Though Dunamunda fell to Saxon forces quickly and with little resistance, Patkul gravely misjudged the loyalty and intentions of the Livonian nobility. He had expected the Livonian nobility to join Augustus and Riga to fall quickly too. However, Livonian support was minimal, and Saxon forces alone were not strong enough to take the city. Learning of the Danish defeat, Augustus II retreated across the Dunaj River in hope that Charles would agree to a ceasefire. Charles arrived with a part of his army in Pernau in autumn. As Augustus retreated beyond the Dunaj River for winter quarters, Charles decided to head towards Narva and the Russian army. The rest of the Swedish War Council, along with foreign emissaries, tried to persuade Charles to postpone the attack on the Russian army until after the winter had passed and the army was united. Charles, however, wished nothing other than to meet his enemy in open battle, and not even the knowledge of the size of the Russian army could dissuade him. While marching towards Narva on the 7th of November.
That's very ballsy. I don't know, I think I kind of agree with the advisors on this one. Yeah, first of all, don't fight the Russians in winter. That never goes well. And also, wait till the army's assembled, right? But Charles seems to be a real go-getter. He's like, no, we're just gonna go. Normally, I think I would have sided with the advisors on this one. I think their caution was well-founded. But then again, Charles so far has been doing well, but he still is very young, so... I don't know, it's that youth, right? He's barely getting a taste of battle right now. And, I guess we'll see.
A part of the Swedish army clashed with a Russian raiding party under the command of Boris Sheremetyev at Yurvi. Although the Russian raiding party suffered relatively heavy casualties compared to the Swedish ones, General Sheremetyev became aware of how far the Swedish army was from Narva. On the 18th of November, Charles XII arrived with his army at the village of Lagena, about 8 kilometers away from Narva. Seeing that many of the horses were ill and that there was heavy snowfall, he knew he needed to act quickly. As soon as he was certain that Narva had not fallen and that his men were ready, Charles left Lagena.
Fast-track your career path with short-term training at UEI College in Southern California. You can get hands-on training.
Meanwhile, the Russians, being aware that the Swedish army was on its way, began defensive preparations. Trenches were dug around the Narva River's meander, and wooden stakes were placed in the center on the Goldenhof Hill. There were 2 rows of ramparts running alongside the trench as well, and between them there were soldiers' barracks. Several artillery batteries were placed along the trenches, although they would not have any effect on the battle, as the Russian army ran out of ammunition several weeks before. Sources differ when it comes to the exact size of the Russian army, but modern estimates agree that they had between 35,000 and 40,000 men at their disposal, with the overwhelming majority being infantry. The Russian forces were stretched for over 6 kilometers on their side of the trenches. The Russian army was under the general command of Peter I and Field Marshal Fyodor Golovin. The right wing of the Russian forces were commanded by General Avtanom Golovin, the center by Ivan Trubetskoy, and the left by Adam Verde. The Russian cavalry, placed on the far side of their left wing, near the bank of the Narva River, was commanded by Boris Sheremetyev. The Swedes had around 9,000 men, out of which 5,500 were grenadiers, 3,500 dragoon cavalry, and 37 cannons. The army was split into 2 relatively equal parts. The right wing contained 3,000 grenadiers, and was commanded by Otto Welling, a veteran of the Scanian War. It was divided into 3 columns, with the one in the center being smaller and being hollow in the middle. The left wing was divided into 2 groups, with one being commanded by Field Marshal Carl Gustav Rientsköld and the other by Magnus Stenbock. Rientsköld had around 1,500 infantry, divided into 2 columns, while Stenbock had 1,000 infantrymen under his command. The Swedish cavalry was positioned on the flanks, mostly in order to guard the infantry against Russian flanking maneuvers. Charles XII himself led the cavalry on the left flank. The Swedish artillery corps, under the command of Johan Hublad, had 16 artillery pieces placed in between the left and right wing of the army, and 21 were positioned on the left wing. Moving his army through the forest and barely...
It's the numbers that are making me think right now. Like, they said the estimate for the Russians were, what, 30 to 40,000? Charles has 9,000. It's those numbers that worry me at the second for Charles. How's this gonna go, man?
Passable trails, Charles reached the outskirts of Narva and positioned himself on Germansberg Hill. After performing reconnaissance of the Russian defences, at 10 AM on the 19th, Charles positioned his army in preparation for battle. He was hoping to meet Peter on the battlefield. However, the Tsar had left Narva the day before the battle, taking Fyodor Golovin with him. The command of the army was passed to Charles Eugene de Croix, a Saxon diplomatic envoy to Peter. De Croix, aware of his lack of military skill, was initially unwilling to take command of the army. However, it is said that Peter convinced him over a glass of wine. Afternon Golovin, Bieda, and Trebetskoy were just as inexperienced as de Croy was. The most capable Russian commander at Narva was Boris Sheremetyev, although he was passed over for holding a lower rank than the others. The Russian commanders...
That seems weird that Peter just left and tried to convince some dude with minimal experience to take control. That's a bit odd. But I mean, Charles is barely getting his hands into war, so he's not like that experienced also. I mean, in terms of like tenure, right? But he has already shown he has like skill. So I don't know, that's interesting.
Even though fielding a superior force, were unwilling to commit to open battle, fearing that the Swedish army that they were seeing was merely the vanguard of a much greater unit. The battle commenced when Charles ordered his soldiers to fire 2 volleys at their enemies and advance towards the trenches. At 2 PM, the weather changed. A heavy snowstorm and hailstorm started, and the wind was blowing directly in the face of the Russian soldiers. Using the snowstorm as a screen, Charles ordered his men to fill up the trenches with fascines and start directly assaulting the Russian positions. In less than 15 minutes, the Swedish infantry filled up the trenches enough for their cavalry to pass. The Russian soldiers did not see the Swedes until they were right in front of them.
So I'm seeing the disadvantages already for the Russians is that they don't have the most competent people leading already. That's one. 2, they're under the assumption that Charles' army is bigger than it actually is, so that's not letting them... If they knew how big his army actually was and how big they were, they probably wouldn't have been afraid to give battle. They're unaware of the enemy's true force, therefore they're being too cautious with not giving him battle. And 3, the weather. It's kind of like in Cannae, right? Where in the Battle of Cannae between Hannibal and Rome, where I think the dust was going towards the Romans. So now the weather is now blocking, screening the Swedish army. So, dang, just a lot going against the Russians here.
The infantry under the command of Rienschold quickly captured the artillery batteries in the center, while the infantry under Stenbock directly assaulted the Russian army. Due to the number of barracks and the bad positioning of the Russian ramparts, the Russian troops did not have much room to maneuver, and brutal close-quarters combat ensued, where the Swedish soldiers had the clear upper hand. Due to the relentless Swedish assault and the surprise of the attack, the majority of the Russian right flank descended into complete disarray. A large number of the soldiers fled towards the bridge to the north. Few managed to escape though, as the bridge collapsed under their weight, taking many men with it to the bottom of the river. Many of the Russian soldiers tried swimming across the ice-cold river as well, with almost all drowning in the process. The soldiers who were left in the trenches also started to flee, only to be forced back by Charles's dragoons. The only part of the Russian right which still posed some organized resistance were the elite Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky guards. They created a wagon fort on the far side of the Russian right wing, near the Narva River. Continuous assaults against the wagon fort did not yield any results, and the Swedish army suffered heavy casualties. In the meantime, the Swedish right wing saw as much success as the left.
Dang, look at the Russians' right just completely collapsed in like one foul swoop. My goodness, this was bold, and dang, Charles proved me wrong. Like this is going incredibly well right now for him.
The Russian forces were quickly routed, and part of the Swedish right was able to join the left wing shortly afterwards. Sheremetyev, seeing that the cavalry would be useless in this type of close-quarters combat, fled southwards. De Croy, also aware of how dire the situation was, decided to surrender to Charles. As night began to fall, the battle became even more fierce and bloody. Charles drew up many of his footmen in between the city and the entrenchments so that he could not be surprised from any side. Wishing to cut the lines of communication between what was left of the Russian army's wings, Charles ordered Hublot to capture the artillery battery on Goldenhof Hill. By morning, General Golovin surrendered as well. His troops were allowed to keep their arms, as Charles admired the bravery of the two elite guards. General Wiede, learning of the surrender of the right wing, subsequently surrendered the left wing. After receiving the arms and standards of the left wing, Charles allowed the rest of the Russian army to leave over the bridge, which his forces had already repaired. The battle was a catastrophe for the Russians.
Dude, Charles like completely dominated that battle with a numerically inferior force with a lot of advantages. Like I mentioned, some of the things going against Russia. That is beyond impressive, especially for someone young and new to all this. Like I said, I'm just that's a great like debut, you know?
As their casualties amounted up to 10,000 men, with De Croix and most of the other commanders ending up as prisoners. The Swedish army, on the other hand, lost less than 1,500 men. To make matters worse for the Russians, the Swedes had captured 143 cannons and 28 mortars, almost the entire amount of artillery that Peter the Great had at his disposal, as well as the entire Russian baggage train. The Battle of Narva confirmed two things to Europe: that the Swedish army was one of the best, and that the Russian army was as ineffective as it was large. Charles XII, merely 18 years of age, proved that he was a more than capable military commander, who, backed by an army of as great quality as the Swedish one, could overcome the insurmountable odds that were stacked against him. With the victory at Narva, a complete Swedish victory in the war seemed like a distinct possibility. On the other hand, knowing that his army was merely beginning to reform, Peter the Great was not disheartened, and he famously remarked, "They have beaten us, they might beat us again, but in time they will teach us how to beat them."
Dang. Alright guys, I'm gonna stop this first part right here at the Battle of Narva, but overall a great showing. I'm gonna watch this entire series in one go, so I'm off to record the next video. See you tomorrow.